In 1943, a train carrying British prisoners of war moved slowly eastward through German-controlled Europe. Most of the men inside had already lost one battle. Many had been captured in North Africa. They had surrendered their weapons, been searched, counted, transported from one holding camp to another, and eventually packed aboard trains heading deep into territory controlled by Hitler's Reich. They knew they were going to prison. What they did not know was that some of them were about to be taken inside the machine that was keeping Germany at war. Through gaps in the railway cars, they began seeing a landscape very different from the battlefield they had left behind. Railway sidings filled with freight cars, coal trains, electrical lines, chimneys, steel structures, chemical plants, factories that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon, and everywhere people were working, German civilians, foreign workers. Prisoners, men and women brought from occupied Europe. The British soldiers had heard about German industry before. Now they were being carried directly into it. Germany had been fighting Britain for almost 4 years. Its armies were spread across Europe. Its cities were increasingly being bombed. Millions of German men were serving in uniform. And yet, in places such as Upper Silesia, enormous industrial complexes continued operating and expanding. For a prisoner watching from a railway wagon, it could create a disturbing impression. Germany did not look like a country about to stop fighting. It looked like a giant factory with an army attached to it. But the closer the prisoners came to that factory, the more complicated the picture became. Because the industrial machine they were about to enter was powerful, it was also desperate. And hidden inside it was one of the great weaknesses of Hitler's war economy. Germany was running out of people. The war had removed millions of men from German industry and agriculture. As the conflict expanded and German casualties increased, the regime filled the gaps with labor taken from across occupied Europe. By August 1944, more than 7.5 million non-German workers were registered as working inside the Reich. The overwhelming majority had not come voluntarily. Prisoners, deported civilians, and concentration camp inmates had become essential to German production. The British prisoners were about to become part of that system too. For many, the first major destination was Stalag VIIB at Lambsdorff in Silesia. It was less a single prison than the center of an enormous network. From Lambsdorff, thousands of prisoners could be distributed into hundreds of smaller working detachments. Some went to farms, others went into coal mines, some repaired railways, others worked in paper mills, steelworks, chemical plants, power stations, and construction sites. Across the region, prisoner labor had become woven into Germany's industrial economy. Records associated with Stalag VIIB list hundreds of working parties scattered through mines, factories, and industrial sites. For enlisted prisoners, captivity therefore did not necessarily mean sitting behind barbed wire waiting for the war to end. It could mean waking before dawn and walking under guard into the industries that were helping their enemy continue the war. And in September 1943, a group of British and Commonwealth prisoners was sent to perhaps the most disturbing industrial complex of all, Monowitz. The name would later become inseparable from Auschwitz. But to the men arriving there, the first thing they encountered was not simply a camp. It was industry on a gigantic scale. The IG Farben Company was constructing an enormous chemical complex there, intended to produce synthetic materials vital to the German economy. Germany had a fundamental wartime problem. Modern armies consumed fuel at an extraordinary rate, but Germany did not possess oil resources comparable to those available to several of its enemies. The German solution was chemistry. Coal could be transformed into synthetic fuels. Chemical plants could produce substances that Germany could not obtain in sufficient quantities from natural resources. Synthetic petrol, rubber, and other industrial products therefore became strategically important. That meant places like Monowitz and Blechhammer were more than factories. They were attempts to engineer Germany out of shortages. And now British prisoners were being brought in to help build and maintain them. The Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial records that the first groups of British POWs arrived near the Auschwitz industrial complex in September 1943. They included men from Britain and other parts of the Commonwealth, including New Zealand, Canada, and South Africa. Eventually, roughly 1,200 to 1,300 British and Commonwealth POWs were there before the number fell as prisoners were transferred elsewhere. Almost immediately, there was a problem. The prisoners understood what the factory represented. They were protected, at least in theory, by the Geneva Convention. Prisoners could be required to work under certain circumstances, but compelling them to perform work directly connected with military operations raised serious questions. The men argued that a plant producing materials and fuel for Germany's war machine was not ordinary civilian work. According to the Auschwitz Memorial's historical account, a delegation of British POWs protested their assignment. The German response made the balance of power painfully clear. The protest changed nothing. The men went to work, but there was another problem for the Germans. British prisoners might have been physically inside the German industrial machine. That did not mean they intended to make it run efficiently. There were countless ways of resisting without openly attacking a guard. Work slowly, misunderstand an instruction, lose a tool, take too long to complete a task. Disappear into another part of the construction site, make a repair that would soon require another repair. The German management repeatedly struggled with prisoner productivity. The Auschwitz Memorial notes complaints about British prisoners working slowly and vanishing for long periods around the construction area. To the Germans, these men were labor. To the prisoners, every minute wasted could become a tiny act of war. And then there was something else the British began to see. They were prisoners, but around them were people whose situation was far worse. Polish workers, Soviet laborers, Jewish prisoners, concentration camp inmates, men and women living under completely different systems of control. British POWs could receive Red Cross parcels and, depending on circumstances, parcels from home. Inside those parcels were objects that had become almost unimaginable luxuries in wartime Europe. Chocolate, cigarettes, food, small items that could be traded. The prisoners discovered that a cigarette could become currency. Food could become currency. And sometimes those supplies could be passed to people whose rations were dramatically worse. German factory officials noticed. The Auschwitz Memorial records German complaints that British POWs distributed food and cigarettes among other workers and prisoners. For the British soldiers, the contrast must have been impossible to miss. They were prisoners of Germany, but Germany itself had constructed an entire hierarchy of captivity. One man could be behind wire and still possess protections another man did not. One prisoner could receive a parcel. Another might be worked until his body failed, and all of them could walk through the gates of the same industrial complex each morning. The size of the system was extraordinary. By the later years of the war, concentration camps and their subcamps had spread beside mines, factories, and construction projects across German-controlled territory. The SS increasingly supplied prisoners to German industry. Private companies, including firms such as Siemens, Junkers, Messerschmitt, and IG Farben, used forced labor as Germany's manpower shortages deepened. This was Germany's industrial might in 1943 and 1944, not simply machines. People, millions of them, some paid, some conscripted, some imprisoned, some enslaved. The factories could appear powerful from the outside. From inside, British POWs could see what it took to keep them running. Then hundreds of those prisoners were moved again. Their next destination would become one of the most important locations in this story, Blechhammer. In February and March 1944, roughly 800 British POWs were transferred away from the Monowitz area to other industrial construction sites, including Blechhammer and Heidebrecht. Blechhammer was another enormous chemical and synthetic fuel complex in Upper Silesia. Here, Germany was trying to manufacture something it desperately needed: petrol. The German military could build tanks, it could manufacture aircraft, it could produce artillery pieces, but none of them mattered if Germany could not fuel them. Synthetic oil plants were therefore among the arteries of Hitler's war machine, and Blechhammer was part of that network. A Red Cross inspection from February 1944 recorded 866 British POWs at Working Detachment S714 Blechhammer. They were engaged in construction work for an industrial firm connected with the chemical sector and worked roughly 8.5 hours per day. Imagine the view: pipes running overhead, steel frameworks climbing into the sky, industrial towers, railway lines delivering equipment, construction crews everywhere, smoke, steam, mud, machinery, thousands upon thousands of workers. A factory so large that an individual human being could disappear visually inside it. For Britain, this was the enemy's industrial system seen from ground level, but Blechhammer revealed the paradox even more clearly than Monowitz. The plant existed because Germany lacked sufficient natural oil. The labor force was enormous because Germany lacked sufficient German workers, and increasingly the factory's existence was known to Allied intelligence. In 1944, the war reached Blechhammer from the sky. Allied strategic planners had begun concentrating heavily on Germany's fuel system. Oil was becoming one of the highest priority targets of the bombing offensive. Refineries, synthetic oil plants, storage facilities, hydrogenation plants. The logic was simple: destroy fuel production and Germany's tanks, trucks and aircraft would eventually become useless machines. RAF historical records of the oil campaign list Blechhammer among the synthetic oil targets attacked during the final phase of the war. For the British prisoners working there, this created a horrifying situation. The aircraft approaching overhead belonged to the Allies. The bombs were meant to weaken Germany, but the men standing near the target were Allied prisoners. The machinery around them was exactly what Allied bombers had been ordered to destroy. They could hear the warning sirens, they could see workers moving, they could watch formations appearing overhead, and they knew they were standing inside the aiming point. One British prisoner, Eric Reeves, later recalled being sent to Blechhammer in 1942 and working around the oil refinery complex. He remembered the huge mixture of forced laborers from across Europe and described Allied bombing beginning in 1944. He also recalled that POWs were not allowed to use the air raid shelters they had helped build. Now the industrial giant that had looked so formidable from the railway was becoming a trap. The bombs did not know the difference between a German engineer and a British prisoner. A factory wall did not become safe because an Allied soldier was standing beside it. When the bombers arrived, German industry, German guards, and Allied prisoners all existed inside the same target box, and men died. British archival records contain post-war investigations into the ill-treatment and deaths of POWs at Blechhammer war camps, including BAB-21, BAB-48, and E3. On December 2, 1944, one attack was especially devastating for the British prisoners. A surviving camp communication reported that 30 British POWs were killed during an air attack affecting Blechhammer working parties. 30 men who had survived capture, survived transportation, survived the camps, survived months or years behind German wire, only to be killed beneath Allied bombs aimed at the industrial system in which Germany had placed them. And by then, something had changed. The industrial machine was still enormous, the smokestacks were still there, the chemical plants were still operating, workers were still reporting every morning, German guards were still issuing orders. But the appearance of unstoppable industrial strength was beginning to crack. Fuel production was being attacked repeatedly, rail lines were damaged, cities were bombed, factories were repaired and bombed again, workers cleared rubble. New laborers replaced those who disappeared. Germany's response was often to demand still more labor from prisoners and foreign workers. The system became more brutal as it became more desperate. The irony was extraordinary. The Third Reich had conquered much of Europe partly because of its ability to combine military force with modern industry. Now, in the final phase of the war, that same industrial system increasingly depended upon people taken from the countries Germany had invaded. A British prisoner could be forced to repair a German chemical plant. A Polish civilian could be transported hundreds of miles to work for the Reich. A Soviet prisoner might work under starvation conditions. A concentration camp prisoner could be sent to a factory beside a major German corporation. Germany had created a continental labor machine, but needing millions of unwilling workers was not evidence of unlimited strength. It was evidence that something underneath the machinery was breaking, and the British POWs were close enough to see both sides. They saw the scale, but they also saw the shortages. They saw the factories, but they also saw who was doing the work. They saw German engineering, but they also saw Allied bombs turning that engineering into twisted steel. They saw a war economy that could build enormous synthetic fuel plants. But they also understood why Germany needed synthetic fuel in the first place. The industrial might was real, so was the desperation behind it. Then came the winter of 1944 and 1945. The Soviet army was pushing westward. German forces were retreating. The prison camps and industrial installations of Silesia were now threatened from the east. The Germans faced another problem. What should they do with the prisoners? Leaving tens of thousands of Allied POWs behind would mean allowing them to be liberated, so the prisoners were moved again, but this time there were fewer trains, fuel was scarce, railways were under attack. Germany's transport system was collapsing. The solution was brutally primitive. They would walk. Across the final months of the war, more than 80,000 Allied POWs were forced westward from camps threatened by the Soviet advance. Many were already weakened by inadequate food and years of captivity. They marched across Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Germany during one of the harshest winters of the war. Men who had once entered Germany through an efficient railway network now crossed the collapsing Reich on foot. The difference was impossible to ignore. Years earlier, trains had carried soldiers, prisoners, coal, and raw materials across a functioning continental system. Now roads filled with retreating troops, refugees, prisoners, carts, damaged vehicles, people moving west because the Eastern Front was coming toward them. Factories still existed, but many had no fuel. Railways existed, but bridges and junctions had been bombed. Aircraft existed, but aviation fuel was increasingly precious. Tanks existed, but a tank without petrol was simply several tons of steel. The prisoners who had once looked through railway wagons at Germany's industrial world were now walking through its collapse. And perhaps that is the most important part of their story. Because Germany's industrial power during the Second World War was not an illusion. It was formidable. German engineers built extraordinary machines. German factories produced vast quantities of weapons. Chemical companies developed sophisticated synthetic processes. Railways connected industrial regions across the Reich and occupied Europe. For years, the system helped Germany wage war against enemies with far greater combined resources. But by bringing British prisoners inside that system, Germany unintentionally gave some of its enemies a view few soldiers ever received. They saw the war from inside the factory. They saw that modern warfare was not only decided by tanks on a battlefield. It was decided by coal, railways, oil, chemicals, electrical power, workers, food, transportation, replacement parts, and time. Take away enough of those things and even the most terrifying army begins to stop moving. The British prisoners also witnessed something darker. Germany's wartime industry could no longer be separated from its system of coercion. By 1944, millions of foreign laborers were working inside the Reich, while prisoners and concentration camp inmates were increasingly used by German industry. Blechhammer itself existed beside a vast network of forced labor camps. The nearby Auschwitz subcamp at Blechhammer held thousands of Jewish prisoners who were made to construct the synthetic gasoline plant under brutal conditions. British POWs occupied a different legal and racial category and generally had protections other prisoners did not. That distinction mattered, but it also meant they could see the system around them. They were close enough to witness how Germany was trying to replace missing resources with chemistry and missing workers with captive human beings. And eventually, they watched Allied air power attack the very facilities Germany had forced them to help build. So when we imagine a British prisoner arriving in Germany and staring at the factories outside his railway carriage, the story does not end with amazement at German industrial might. That is only the beginning. The real story is what happened after he went through the factory gates. From a distance, the Reich appeared to be a machine. Up close, the prisoners could see every moving part. And by 1945, they could also see those parts beginning to fail. The smokestacks did not disappear overnight. The factories did not stop in a single moment. Germany continued fighting until May 1945. But eventually, there were limits that engineering could not overcome. No chemical process could replace every lost oil field. No forced labor program could completely replace millions of men sent into the army. No repair crew could indefinitely rebuild every railway and refinery destroyed from the air. And no industrial system, however impressive, could permanently compensate for fighting the combined economic power of the United States, the British Empire, and the Soviet Union. The British POWs had entered captivity believing they had been defeated. Many would leave Germany after witnessing something very different. They had seen the enemy's strength closer than almost anyone. But they had also seen the price of maintaining it. Behind the factories were shortages. Behind the production figures were prisoners. Behind the synthetic fuel was the absence of enough natural oil. Behind the endless construction was a regime desperately trying to replace everything. The war was consuming, and behind the image of an unstoppable industrial empire was a machine that required more fuel, more workers, and more time than Germany ultimately possessed. The prisoners had arrived inside Hitler's industrial machine. Then they lived long enough to watch it come apart.